In one of the most dramatic stories in the Bible, the prophet Elijah stands alone on Mount Carmel, facing 450 prophets of the god Baal. They are competing for something very simple: whose God is real? Both sides prepare a sacrifice. No fire is allowed. The God who answers with fire from heaven, well, that is the true God. The prophets of Baal go first. They call out, "O Baal, answer us." They dance. They shout for hours. They even start cutting themselves with swords and lances. Nothing happens. The text says, "But there was no voice, no answer." And Elijah is not a particularly polite prophet. He starts mocking them. Maybe your God is asleep or busy or out on a journey. Still nothing. Then Elijah steps up. He prays once, and fire falls from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, consuming the wood, and even consuming the water poured over it. It is a clear message. Baal is powerless, and the God of Israel is all-powerful. Now, Baal was one of the most important gods in the ancient Near East. A storm god, a warrior, a king, the one who brought rain and made crops grow. On the surface, this story draws a sharp line between two completely different gods: Baal on one side and the God of Israel on the other. But when you look closely at the Hebrew Bible, the God of Israel starts to sound kind of Baalish. They both thunder from the heavens. They both ride on the clouds, and they defeat the sea and its monsters. So, what is going on here? Is Baal simply a false foreign rival to the God of Israel? Or are we looking at two traditions that are more deeply connected than the Bible lets on? Today, we are asking a deceptively simple question: who is Baal? In ancient Semitic languages, Baal or Baal is a completely ordinary word. It means something like Lord, Master, Owner, or even husband. It is the kind of word you can use for a landowner or the head of a household, in addition to a god. So sometimes when we encounter the word in ancient texts, it does not function as the name of a particular god, but rather it is like saying the Lord, much like how a Christian might refer to the Christian God simply as the Lord. We can see this especially clearly in the book of Hosea. In Hosea 2:16, God says, "You will call me my husband and no longer call me my Baal." Here Baal seems to be a title, meaning my Lord or my Master. And some scholars have even suggested that this implies that Baal could have been a title for the God of Israel. But the prophet here rejects that title because of what it has been linked with. Immediately after, Hosea says that God will remove from Israel's lips the names of the Baals, not one capital B Baal, but many lowercase Baals. This helps explain something about how the Hebrew Bible uses the term. It often doesn't treat Baal like a simple proper name. Instead, we find the definite article, "the," applied to the word, the Baal. And the plural use of the phrase, the Baals, might suggest the word can function more like a category than a single deity. So the Hebrew Bible seems to use the term to refer to a whole range of local gods: the Baal of Peor, the Baal of Tyre, the Baal of Ekron. At least one scholar, Susan Ackerman, has even argued that the Baal of Peor may not have been a storm god at all, but a local manifestation of the Canaanite high god El. So there is some ambiguity in the Bible. The biblical authors may be collapsing a diversity of local deities into one convenient shorthand: Baals, functioning as a catch-all term for other foreign gods, especially in polemical contexts, when the author is elevating the God of Israel as the supreme God. But outside of the Bible, we also find evidence that Baal could function as an actual divine name for a specific god. And scholars think that in most cases of the references to Baal in the Hebrew Bible are referencing a specific storm god in the Canaanite pantheon. Now, The Canaanites were the ancient peoples of ancient Canaan, a region that roughly corresponds to present-day Israel, Palestine, Western Jordan, Lebanon, and parts of Syria, who all shared closely related languages, cultures, and religions. And the single most important text for understanding this Canaanite Baal is what scholars call the Baal Cycle, the longest literary work preserved in the Ugaritic language. Ugaritic was a Semitic language spoken in the Late Bronze Age that was closely related to Hebrew. We only know of it because of the discovery of Ugarit, an ancient city on the Syrian coast, where archaeologists uncovered a royal library filled with clay tablets. The Baal Cycle itself survives across 6 tablets, though some are fragmentary, dating roughly between the 1200s and 1100s BCE. These texts offer some of the clearest and most detailed evidence we have for Canaanite mythology. Think of the Baal Cycle as a mythic drama told in 3 acts. First, Baal battles Yam, the sea god. Then there is a quest to build Baal's royal palace, and then Baal faces Mot, the god of death. A confrontation that leads to Baal's downfall, his return, and the final test of his kingship. The Baal Cycle opens with a tense scene among the gods. At the center is El, the high god in the Canaanite pantheon. He is a patriarchal figure who presides over the divine council. El commands the craftsman god Kothar Wahasis to prepare a palace for Yam, whose name literally just means the sea. This signals that El favors Yam as the king, but Baal does not submit to Yam's rule, and rather than helping build Yam's palace, Kothar instead arms Baal with 2 divine clubs, Yagrush and Ayamor, chaser and driver, the text says, and Baal slays Yam. The weapon leaps from Baal's hand. It strikes the head of Prince Yam between the eyes. Yam collapses and falls to the earth. His joints shake and his form sinks. Baal drags and dismembers Yam. Baal's victory is immediately interpreted as a political event, and the other gods begin to proclaim his kingship. Kothar announces, Yam surely is dead. Baal reigns. He indeed rules. So right at the beginning of the Baal cycle, we learn that Baal is a divine warrior who wins kingship through combat, bringing order by destroying the chaos of the sea. The Baal cycle's second major arc is the building of his palace on Mount Safon. In the story, this palace is the visible proof of Baal's kingship, and once it is built, the narrative culminates in a feast for the gods, a kind of victory tour in a dramatic theophany, an appearance that presents Baal as the newly established king. Now, on the surface, building a palace might seem like a boring thing for myth to focus on, but this is actually where the Baal cycle becomes especially interesting. Some have argued that the story reflects a kind of ritual logic, linking Baal's mountain and his temple in Ugarit. See, like Mount Olympus in Greek mythology, Mount Safon was not just a mythological location, it was a real mountain on the northern Syrian coast, probably the modern Jebel al-Akra, 19 miles north of Ugarit. At the same time, excavations at Ugarit have revealed that the city itself was built around Baal. At the highest point, the Acropolis of the city, archaeologists uncovered 2 massive temples, one dedicated to Baal and one to Dagon, possibly understood as Baal's father. They were the most prominent structures in the city, and you could probably even see them from the coast, acting as landmarks for ships approaching the harbor, less than a kilometer away, and the city was oriented around these temples. They occupied the highest elevation. The palace and the temples seem to have been connected by a road, and everything about their placement signals importance. And texts from Ugarit including ones discovered inside Baal's temple, regularly refer to him as Baal of Cyphon, even in everyday contexts like offerings and legal contracts. And at the same time, these rituals are taking place in the temple in Ugarit. This has led some scholars to argue that the mountain and the elevated temple were ritually merged. In other words, when people went up to Baal's temple in Ugarit, they were ritually and symbolically approaching Mount Cyphon itself. The architecture seems to reinforce this idea. Now, it is a little hard to tell from the photographs, but the temple was likely built as a tall, multi-level structure with stairways and elevated spaces that allowed the priests or even the king himself to move upward toward more sacred areas. This created a kind of vertical progression. So the Baal Cycle and the built environment of Ugarit itself line up. The Baal Cycle says Baal builds a palace on a mountain. The city builds a temple at its highest point, and rituals involve ascending upward toward his divinity. So basically we see Baal as the divine protector of Ugarit and the patron deity of the royal house. The third and final act of the Baal Cycle shifts to Baal's conflict with Mot, the god of death. Up to this point, Baal looks unstoppable. He defeated Yam. He built his palace. He has established his rule. But Mot represents a different kind of threat. After all, he is death itself. Baal sends a messenger to Mot to declare his kingship. But he warns, don't get too close. But take care, divine servants. Do not get too close to divine Mot, lest he take you like a lamb in his mouth. Like a baby goat, you be crushed in the chasm of his throat. See, unlike Yam, Mot doesn't fight with weapons. The imagery here evokes a lion eating young livestock. He will literally eat you. And Mot describes his appetite in almost grotesque terms, devouring gods, swallowing everything. So let me tear you to pieces. Let me eat flanks, innards, forearms. Surely you will descend into divine Mot's throat. And sure enough, he devours Baal, and the consequences are immediate. The rain stops. The earth dries up. Fertility collapses. The text says, "The furrows in the fields have dried. The furrows in El's fields have dried." Where is Baal the conqueror? Where is the prince, the lord of the earth? This is one of the clearest moments in the text, where Baal's identity as a storm and fertility god comes into focus. When Baal is gone, life itself is threatened. Now Baal is eventually restored, but not by defeating Mot in a straightforward battle. Instead, the turning point comes through the intervention of the goddess Anat. She confronts Mot directly, and in one of the most striking scenes, destroys him. She seizes divine Mot with a sword. She splits him with a sieve. She winnows him with a fire. She burns him with millstones. She grinds him in a field. She sows him. It is a violent scene, but notice it is also an agricultural scene. Anat doesn't just kill Mot. She subjects him to an agricultural death. She threshes him, grinds him, and literally plants him. And through this, Baal returns. The rains resume, fertility is restored, and Baal ultimately retains his kingship. This section of the Baal cycle brings these aspects of Baal together. He is a warrior and a king, but he's also tied to storms, agriculture, and agricultural fertility. One section of the Baal cycle reads, "Beneficial for the land is the rain of Baal, and for the field the rain of the Mighty One, beneficial to the wheat in the furrow." Another Ugaritic text puts it this way, "And yet, behold, Baal made his rain abundant. He made the chariot abundant in the shower of rain." That image of the chariot is important because in Ugaritic thought, the clouds themselves are imagined as Baal's chariot, earning him the epithet Cloud Rider. Riding across the sky, Baal brings rain. Now, this storm warrior god that we later meet as Baal already had a long history under a different name, Hadad or Adu. His name may have meant something like thunderer. This is essentially the same type of deity, a storm god who controls thunder, rain, and agricultural fertility. But he is attested much earlier than the Baal cycle, going back as far as the early Bronze Age in Syria and Mesopotamia around the 3rd millennium BCE. In places like the ancient Semitic city-state Mari, in modern-day Syria, Hadad is already a major figure, a divine warrior who wields thunder as a weapon, defeats the sea, and stands at the center of royal ideology. In one text, from Mari, dating to the 18th century BCE, a prophet even describes Hadad lending his own divine weapons to a human king, the same weapons Hadad used to defeat the sea. I have brought you back to the throne of your father's dynasty, and I have given you the weapons I used to do combat with the sea. So the basic profile is already there, a powerful storm god who battles the sea, the same thing that Baal does in the Baal Cycle, which dates roughly 600 years after this text. So by the late Bronze Age, in Ugarit, the name Baal, which again literally just means Lord, has become the primary way of referring to Hadad in Canaanite contexts. And in fact, scholars often use the name Baal Hadad to refer to this specific manifestation of the storm god. But traces of that older name didn't completely disappear. In fact, in the Ugaritic texts, you can sometimes see Baal and Hadu used in parallel, almost like two names for the same figure. What this suggests is not that Hadad and Baal are totally different gods, but that Baal likely developed out of earlier traditions linked with Hadad. Over time, the title Baal, Lord, became the standard way of referring to this storm deity in Canaanite religion, a later expression of a much older West Semitic storm god, whose roots run deep into ancient Near Eastern history. So what does Baal look like in art? One of the most recognizable ways Baal is depicted is as a striding warrior. He's shown stepping forward, his arm raised, gripping a weapon, usually a club or a spear. The most famous example comes from a carved stone monument discovered only 20 meters away from his temple, sometimes just called the Baal Stele. Here, Baal strides forward as a warrior. In one hand, he holds what appears to be a stylized lightning bolt. In the other, a raised club. Beneath his feet are what look like jagged lines, maybe representing mountains where he was believed to dwell, or representing his defeat of the sea. And on his head is a crown with bull horns, a symbol of strength, fertility, and power throughout the ancient Near East. And all throughout the ancient Near East, archaeologists have uncovered small, bronze bull figurines, like this one from Tel Dan in the West Bank. And these are widely interpreted as symbolic representations of gods like Hadad or Baal. We also see this same warrior motif in smaller figurines. Bronze statues from sites like Megiddo, Hazor, and Ugarit show a male deity standing upright as if advancing, with one arm raised to strike. Though we cannot always say for sure that these figurines depict Baal. In many cases, they are simply labeled more cautiously as storm gods or warrior deities, and that is because ancient Near Eastern iconography often used shared visual conventions across different gods. Still, given what we know from texts and better identified images, like the Baal Stele, many scholars think that these figurines likely represent Baal or Hadad. We also see Baal's connection to agriculture in this iconography. Looking back at that stele from Ugarit, scholars have argued that this weapon in his hand is not just a lightning bolt. It also takes the form of a plant, an object representing both lightning from the heavens and vegetation from the earth. We see this too in a cylinder seal from Ugarit. Cylinder seals were small carved stones that people would roll across wet clay, basically stamping documents or goods. So this is the kind of imagery that circulated in everyday life. In this example, Baal appears in a familiar warrior stance. In one hand, he holds a mace, but in the other hand, he carries a long spear, whose tip transforms into vegetation, with leaves sprouting out from the weapon. So whether on a monumental stone or a small personal seal, Baal is consistently depicted as both a force of destruction and as a god whose power brings rain, crops, and agricultural abundance. Though some scholars have argued that Baal could also appear seated in a more overtly royal form. So, for example, check out this bronze statue discovered at Hazor, one of the largest and most important Canaanite cities in the southern Levant, located in what's now northern Israel. The statue was found in a monumental structure often interpreted as a temple, and it depicts a male god seated on a throne. Now, at first glance, this kind of image would seem to belong to El, the high god of the Canaanite pantheon, who we saw favoring Yam in the Baal Cycle. In both texts and iconography, El is typically portrayed as an older fatherly figure who sits enthroned presiding over the divine council. Though scholars such as Taleh Ornan have argued that this identification as El might be too quick. This seated figure, and perhaps others in the same style, could instead represent Baal. Remember that the Baal cycle is very fixated on Baal establishing his kingship. The narrative repeatedly emphasizes his throne, rivals like Yam attempting to claim it, allies protecting it, and his victory culminating with his enthronement. In other words, Baal is not just a warrior. He is also a king who sits enthroned. So Dr. Ornan argues that if Baal's kingship is so central in the textual tradition, we should expect that to be reflected in the visual culture as well. So the seated Hazor figure might represent Baal in his post-victory mode, the king enthroned after securing his rule. Okay, so we've sketched out an image of Baal as a storm god, a warrior, and a king. And if you know your Hebrew Bible, that profile might sound familiar because the God of Israel is described in language that sounds a lot like Baal. In fact, scholars such as James Anderson in his book Monotheism and Yahweh's appropriation of Baal have argued that the God of Israel came to be described using imagery that originally belonged to Baal. Take Psalm 29, which is one of the more dramatic examples. In fact, scholars think this was originally a hymn written for Baal that was later appropriated for the God of Israel. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders, the Lord over mighty waters. In this psalm, God is portrayed as a divine warrior and a king with unmistakable storm. God imagery. The phrase voice of God is repeated 7 times. His voice breaks the cedars of Lebanon. It flashes with lightning. It shakes the wilderness. It strips forests bare. The language evokes the power of a storm with thunder and wind. The geographic setting is also significant. The psalm mentions Lebanon, Kadesh on the Orontes, and Syrian, another name for Mount Hermon. These are all locations in the northern Levant in what is today Lebanon and southern Syria. This is not the traditional heartland of the ancient Israelite kingdoms further south. In fact, it is the region where cities like Ugarit are located, and where the worship of Baal is best attested in the archaeological record. By placing God's storm activity in this northern landscape over Lebanon and the mountains of Hermon, The poem situates the God of Israel in territory that would have been closely linked with Baal. And the climax comes in verse 10. God sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. This evokes the same mythic motif seen in the Baal Cycle, where Baal's kingship is established through his victory over the sea. Taken together, this psalm draws on a full range of Baal-like imagery: thunder, lightning, mountains, kingship, and the sea. But here, they are all applied to the God of Israel. Now, I want to be clear. It is kind of simplistic to think of this as mere plagiarism. It might be intentional use of Baal-like imagery as part of anti-Baal propaganda. In other words, it is not like the Israelite authors were simply borrowing a Baal hymn, but that the biblical authors took over Baal's imagery in order to say, no, this is the God of Israel's power. Now we see the same pattern in Psalm 97. The God of Israel appears surrounded by classic storm god imagery. The Lord is king. Let the earth rejoice. Clouds and thick darkness are all around him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. His lightnings light up the world. The earth sees and trembles. Again, these are the defining features of a storm god, the kind of god who controls rain, fertility, and cosmic order. Another example involves Baal's signature epithet, cloud rider. Baal is called rider of the clouds 16 times in Ugaritic texts, and it is a phrase found word for word in Psalm 68, and in a similar form in Psalm 104. Psalm 68 reads, "Sing to God, lift up a song to him, who rides upon the clouds." The same epithet applied to Baal. Another overlap is the plot point we see in the Baal Cycle, when Baal battles the sea and a monstrous serpent. In the Baal Cycle, Baal fights Yam, the sea god, and that victory is connected to him winning his kingship. The Baal Cycle also references a battle between Baal and a multi-headed serpent called Litanu, or Lotan, depending on how you reconstruct the word. And we see a similar mythological motif in the Hebrew Bible, with the God of Israel in the guise of a storm god battling the sea, or a sea monster. Psalm 74 reads, "You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan." Now, Leviathan seems to be the Hebrew cognate to the Ugaritic name Litanu, or Lotan, and here Leviathan is called a multi-headed creature, which tracks with his Ugaritic counterpart, who's described as the ruler with 7 heads. Elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, in Isaiah chapter 27, the God of Israel will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. That description lines up remarkably well with the Ugaritic description of Litanu. In the Baal Cycle, Mott references a previous battle that Baal waged against this monster. When you killed Litanu, the fleeing serpent, finished off the twisting serpent, language that almost perfectly lines up with Isaiah 27, with those adjectives fleeing and twisting. So scholars think that the closest parallels to these passages come from the Canaanite world. Now, ancient cultures all over the ancient Near East told sea combat stories. For example, in Babylon, there is a famous myth where the god Marduk defeats a sea monster named Tiamat. So you might assume that the biblical authors got this idea from Babylon. But when you look at the actual language, the Hebrew words used in these passages line up very closely with words we find in Ugarit. For example, in Hebrew, the word for sea is yam, the exact same word we find in Ugaritic, and Leviathan and Litanu seem to be etymologically linked. So we are not just talking about shared motifs here, we are talking about closely related words and phrases, which leads scholars to think that the immediate background of these texts is Canaanite and not Mesopotamian. But it might go even deeper than literary borrowing. Many scholars now argue that the ancient Israelites emerged out of indigenous Canaanite populations in the late Bronze Age. They spoke a Canaanite language, Hebrew. Their material culture looks Canaanite, and they inherited many of the same cultural and religious traditions. Not only Baal, but also the Canaanite god El and the goddess Asherah, who seems to have been regarded as the consort of the God of Israel. So when biblical texts use Baal-like imagery, storm gods, cloud riders, battles with the sea, it might be more accurate to think of this as drawing from a shared cultural heritage, rather than borrowing from some foreign religion. So let's return to that story of Mount Carmel. The story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings 18 is one of the sharpest examples of religious polemic in the entire Hebrew Bible. This whole story is carefully constructed to make Baal look powerless or even non-existent. Baal's prophets cry out, they dance around, they cut themselves, and they receive no response. Elijah prays only once, and Yahweh answers immediately. Basically, the story sets these two gods up as rivals, though, in an article by the scholar Michael J. Stahl, titled God's Best Friend Enemy, Stahl pushes us to rethink that assumption. He argues that the Bible's portrayal of the God of Israel and Baal as clear opposites is what he calls a later partisan construction. To understand what he means, we need to step back and think about where the Hebrew Bible itself comes from. The Hebrew Bible is largely a product of the kingdom of Judah. See, there were two Hebrew kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north with its capital in Samaria, and the southern kingdom of Judah centered in Jerusalem. Long story short, of the two kingdoms, Israel collapsed first, and Judah stuck around to write its history. So, the Hebrew Bible, from its mostly Judahite perspective, tells a very particular story about Israel's past. Israel was chosen by God alone, bound to him by covenant, and repeatedly led astray by foreign gods like Baal. In this narrative, Baal worship is framed as something alien, something outside Israel's true identity. But Stahl argues that this story is doing ideological work because, when we look at the broader archaeological evidence, Baal worship may have coexisted alongside worship of the God of Israel for centuries without obvious conflict. It only became a problem later when certain groups, especially Judahite elites, began to push for the exclusive worship of the God of Israel. One of the clearest pieces of evidence for this comes from what scholars call theophoric names, names that include the name of a god. These are very valuable because they give us a window into everyday religious life. People name their kids after the gods they venerate, and we still do this today. The name Christopher, for example, literally means bearer of Christ. These names embed religious identity right into personal identity. And when we look at ancient Israel and its neighbors, we find the same thing. So consider an inscription discovered at Khirbet Qeiyafa, a fortified settlement from around the 10th century BCE, possibly connected to early Judahite or Israelite culture. Archaeologists found an inscription here that includes the name Ishbaal, meaning man of Baal. And at a nearby Iron Age site, another inscription preserves the name Jerubbaal, a name that also appears in the Bible as an alternative name for the Israelite leader Gideon. Archaeological finds like this suggest that names invoking Baal were not foreign or hostile to early Israelites. Rather, they seem to have been part of the same religious and linguistic world out of which ancient Israel emerged. We may also see this in a set of administrative records discovered in Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, dating to the 8th century BCE. These texts preserve dozens of personal names. Some names invoke Yahweh, while others invoke Baal, and they appear side by side within the same administrative system. Like, imagine you are working in the same government office in Samaria, and that guy over there has Baal in his name, and that guy over there has Yahweh in his name. No apparent conflict, so scholars like Stahl argue that invoking Baal in ancient Israel was not seen as deviant, it was normal. And we see the same pattern show up in the Bible. There are a lot of names that preserve the divine name Baal, Jerubbaal, Eshbaal, Meribbaal, and even a son of King David himself, Beliada. But that seemed to bother some biblical scribes. In some parts of the Bible, these names appear in one form with the name Baal, but in other parts of the Bible, the same people are referred to with altered versions of those names. For example, in 1 Chronicles, King Saul's son is called Eshbaal, meaning man of Baal. But in the book of Samuel, that same figure is called Ishbosheth, which means man of shame. What seems to have happened is that later, scribes became uncomfortable with the name Baal and replaced it with the word shame. Likewise, King David's son is called Beliada in Chronicles, but just Eliada in Samuel. We are talking about the same person here, but preserved in different textual traditions. So reading between the lines here, it seems that there was a time when invoking Baal in a personal name, even for King David himself, was completely normal. And only later did it become something that scribes felt they needed to avoid. This might be the same thing we saw in Hosea chapter 2. You will call me my husband, and no longer call me my Baal. That line only makes sense if people were actually calling Yahweh Baal. Dr. Stahl writes, while Hosea 2:16-17 criticizes Yahweh's translatability with Baal, the polemic itself betrays Yahweh's deep appropriation of Baal's language, imagery, and attributes. In other words, Hosea chapter 2 reveals the problem. These two gods have become too close. Stahl argues that the God of Israel may have taken on storm God characteristics under the influence of Baal sometime during the Iron Age II period, when the kingdom of Israel was consolidating its political power. He suggests that the northern kingdom's dynasty under King Omri may have modeled the God of Israel on Baal, elevating him into the role of a royal storm god, which brings us back to Elijah. Seen through this lens, the story on Mount Carmel is not just about proving that the God of Israel is stronger than Baal. It is about drawing a boundary, a later attempt to separate the God of Israel from a culture in which Baal was not a foreign rival, but part of the same religious world. A religious world that seems full of rivals. Yam, the sea god. Mot, the god of death.